Thank you so much, Katerina. And thank you, City.js, for having everyone here who has spoken today. Very excited to be closing this talk out. You may notice I am just using my phone and the conference laptop. If you follow me on Twitter, you know that like 1 hour before my flight to Athens, my cat, Rhubarb, who is apparently the model of professional, actually decided to pour like a large glass of water on absolutely everything technological I own. So we're doing this all based on slides I created on my phone. And if you also follow me on Twitter, you know that I like to do a lot of like photos and GIFs. So I'm just gonna do a quick photo, if that's okay. Okay, now we'll get to the professional side, obviously, and give a talk. So, as Katerina mentioned, my name is Emma Twersky. You can find me online at Twersky, last name, first initial. I use the pronouns she, her. And today we're going to talk about modernizing CSS, creating snazzier sites. So, do you ever get so close to things that you can't see how fast they're changing? This happened to me so much if I reflect on the last 2 years. I took this desk plant home on the last day of my previous job, and 2 years later, it looks like this. So it has grown into like a full aloe tree, which, just to give you some context, I live in like the coldest, wettest place, so I'm very proud of this plant. But the thing is, it doesn't happen overnight, and sometimes we don't notice that things are changing until we look back on something and notice just how far it's gone. I think we all have examples of this. And so today, I want to ask the question, when did you last water your plants? And we're going to use that metaphorically to talk about some code, obviously. So I'm very excited to be closing out this awesome JavaScript conference, talking about my absolute favorite coding language, CSS. But CSS has moved light years, and it's really hard to keep up. And frankly, a lot of JavaScript developers maybe are not looking at CSS stuff. It's really easy to keep updated with JavaScript, right? It's semantically versioned, so you're like, oh, what's new in the latest version? Like you can npm update, look at the package version, look at like what's new in that version. CSS doesn't do that, right? Like it's up to the browser to decide what we can and can't write, which is super cool because things can suddenly appear that you've never been able to use, but it means that it's really hard to know when we can use things. Maybe you can write some CSS that will render really well on Chrome, but not so well on like Internet Explorer. And so the goal here is I want to take a look at things in CSS that you can use everywhere in your apps that you maybe don't know about, you're maybe not thinking about, you maybe are stuck in like old ways of how you're just used to writing like your CSS flexbox. It works fine, but maybe there's a better way that is fully stable that you can use to do that. And especially my goal is if you are a framework developer or you're just like a really great JavaScript developer, like walking away with some tangible ways to upgrade your CSS and migrate to maybe some better patterns, some more dynamic, usable patterns. So with that said, the 4 things are going to be sort of tips on visibility. So that's things like controlling what you see and how you see parts of your application. Layout, so how we arrange and position our apps. Theming, so read that as branding for most of us. And then scope, which is really the layering. We'll get to that. So to start out, let's start with visibility. But that is clearly missing something. We need some emojis in the stock. Okay, so in visibility, we control what we see on our app, right? Like you open your web page, you have your website, it's super cool. Normally, like you just think about what you can see on the window. You don't think about anything that's off the DOM. But if you actually look at your DOM tree, there's things that are rendered on the DOM of your page that are not visible to the user. So things like here you can think about like a side nav is a really good example of that, where maybe you have a collapsible side nav that collapses at certain like widths or something like that. And it's always going to be on your DOM, like it's always going to be there and clickable. And you've probably run into this issue where you remove the side nav from your page, but it's still actually visible on your DOM, which is a huge accessibility problem. We've had a bunch of really good accessibility talks already today that have laid out why it's so important to care about that. But imagine how weird it is if you're using a screen reader and you're like navigating through the page and you're seeing stuff that like isn't visible. Like that's super weird. It's terrible UX. And we do really hacky things to get rid of how that works. So a new feature landed across all browsers called inert as part of the movement for the dialog element. So you may see that you can now use like a native HTML dialog element. And as part of that, under the hood, what is less advertised is that in order to create like the best dialog experience, they also gave us control to inert. So on all browsers, you can use this new property called inert. And what that's going to do is it's going to remove all of the ability to like click, see, like fully remove whatever is inert from the DOM, from the accessibility tree, from everything in your browser on all browsers. So in this example, you can see like inert. You've been watching this GIF while I've been explaining this whole time, so like no spoiler, but basically when the side nav is off the page, we want it to be inert. We don't want people to be able to access that, and we don't want to do hacky things to do that. So the code underlying this, and I have demos on my Twitter if you ever want any of the code actually copy and pasteable, is that we're literally just toggling this attribute, right? We're saying like, if it's inert, like switch it. Like we don't want this to be part of this. So if I have this drawer, when it's on the page, I obviously like want to be able to click it. When I take it off, like imagine the body is what you actually see on your web page. Like if that drawer is off there, like make it inert. I don't want to deal with it. And the reason this is really important is if we think about like the like leaking of attributes on the DOM, let's say that like normally our drawer is not just like an empty drawer. Like you're not just toggling something for no reason. There's like menu items, there's things like if this is your personal website, you want to like have details and clickable things and images and all that. And normally we'll go into like each one of those things and make them all non-clickable. We want to make sure every href is like totally removable, and we're doing all this manual stuff. Now like inert is fully follows nesting properties. So if I make the drawer inert, I make everything inside of it inert unless I choose to toggle it otherwise. So I want to make sure like with one attribute, I remove everything. And then when I bring it back, toggle it back on, fully accessible, put it back on the accessibility tree, make sure our screen readers can see it. So if you've been using things like pointer events none, user select none, removing like cursor from things, migrate to like go look at the spec for inert and see if it's right for your use case. This is great for modals, dialogues, all that stuff. So again, like this is hack number one, but if you go into your CSS and search pointer events none, like highly consider if you want to be doing it that way or if you want to use a native element like inert. It's so cool. I think this is like the greatest thing ever. Going along with this, there's sometimes that we want things to be not inert, but not visible. So a really great example of this is if you're using a screen reader, there's this thing that maybe a lot of us haven't experienced, but is actually really great UX called skip to content. So let's say like I'm on my website, you've come onto my website a bunch of times and you know I have a blog and you just want to skip to the blog. Or like I'm a recipe cook, a person who writes recipes. And I have recipes, but you know how recipes have like all the photos advertising the recipe beforehand? Like so much scrollable stuff of like the story behind like the grandma that helped you with the recipe. And like sometimes you don't want that because you've made the recipe 100 times and you already know it's great, so you just want to skip to it, right? So any sort of skip to content thing, sometimes you don't want to see those, right? So sometimes those are just for screen reader experiences. So a lot of times people will do this by like writing all of the CSS to say like make it fully invisible, make it like minuscule, but make it there so that the screen reader can access it. There's a lot of examples of why this might be useful. So Angular has a really great way of doing this, which is providing a CDK of mixin, so a component dev kit of mixins that make it possible to do that. So that, let's say like, again, I have that skip to content, and I have maybe like a checkbox that says like I want to like voice announce certain things to my screen reader. Then like using a CDK or a provided component dev kit of mixins like that is a really great way to do that. If you maintain libraries, like highly consider adding accessibility things for this. So that's number one. And then also in that same kind of component dev kit, think about things like high contrast. So these are other things that have landed fully across browser, but like high contrast is when you say on the user or client side, like I want to make sure that everything reads really high contrast. This is great for people with migraines to use and turn on in their browser to say like, I don't want to see all the snazzy colors. My slides are a great example. I should provide a high contrast version because I have all of the snazzy color on it. But for somebody who maybe doesn't want to see that, I want to provide a way to do that. So again, making sure that you're providing mixins and things like that, but mostly inert. So moving on to flexible layouts. And again, I think there's something missing, and that's really the word dynamic, right? So this is the big word in CSS. We think about like flex, we think about, I mean, just in general, like the big word in web development, I feel like, is dynamic to screen size, to all of these things. So we have CSS Flex, but do you use CSS Flex Grow? And do you use Flex Shrink? And if you use those, do you also provide min and max versions? These are just questions I'm asking before I get to the main part of what I want you to do with layouts, but just throwing that in, if you use Flex, really think about if you can grow and shrink and create a more dynamic layout. Similarly, in Grid, in 2022, layouts are dynamic, and frankly, I think Grid provides a much better solution for dynamic layouts than Flex. It's much more multi-directional. Flex and Grid are also going to be fully compatible, or were made fully compatible across browsers in 2021. So we always use these debates of like, oh, I'm not going to move to CSS Grid because it's not fully compatible, it's not used in all the browsers. We dropped IE support. Like now you can actually go and explore Grid, and it's worth just shouting out that there was a lot of work done to make that possible. So if your excuse was not compatibility for learning CSS Grid, I've now taken away that excuse for you. So the actual point I want to make with layouts is use logical properties. I'm trying to pick really small, really tangible, maintainable ways to upgrade your CSS, and I think this is like a great one, which is we've all heard of these things, we've seen these graphs, these are from CSS Tricks, and it's a really great explanation. But basically, let's say you define like a margin left and a margin right, a margin top, a margin bottom. That's really great for a very static version of what you're creating. But a much better way is to use logical properties and say margin inline, right? So margin inline and margin block. Similarly, margin start or inline start, margin inline end. And the reason that's really important is if we start to think about like translations, like let's say you're creating a really great website and you eventually want to go global, and you start to use like right to left languages versus left to right, maybe with English or Greek. Or maybe you start to go into like APAC audiences and go top to bottom, right? Like margin inline start responds to that. So instead of going back and having to adjust all your code, like go in now and say like, oh, am I using margin left and right? Like I should move that to inline. Super quick, super easy change. But really think about like if you're using left, right, top, bottom, like searching for references of those and moving to inline, moving to block, moving to start, moving to end, because they're really responsive. Similarly, with logical properties, let's say we have like a stack of things, and I just add a little grid to like pancake all of those together. You can place things based on where they are in a div based on logical properties. So place self flex start would move things to like the very top corner. Place center is like a really great way to center things. So if you ever want to center things like CSS grid, place self center, right? You can move things all within a space. And again, make it responsive to, let's say, like the CSS grid grows really large and you actually end up like flipping it or something. Like this will respond and stay dynamic in a way that like making something a relative placement and having to move it like 10 pixels to this specific place is not going to be dynamic as you start to grow, whereas we start to move into like a tablet world I'm hearing about. Similarly, like take a look at has, which is also in that same place. So let's say like I really want to change the background color if I have code in my block. This one line of code with the reference has that looks for code will change the background color, so I can use that to like highlight things in my slide. So again, not really a migration there, but just a cool thing that's fully supported. Moving on to theming, aka branding. If you haven't noticed yet, I'm mentioning a bunch of cool things and then focusing on one that I think you really should do. So I'm going to throw out a bunch of ideas about color space, but I'm not going to give you any super specifics. But there's a ton happening in color space, like right now, like this month. So vibrant colors, color manipulation, auto contrast, like there's all this stuff happening where we think of color as like you define it on this color scale. It's like a circle, right? And basically color math has figured out that the color that we see and perceive is not really a circle. There's like way more greens than we use on the web right now. HWB is like a great example of that, where you define a hue, a whiteness, a blackness. And there's so many other color gamuts. So a great question to start asking your designers now is, what color gamut do you want? And what color gradient do you want? And specifically, just this, what color space do you want this in, right? So a lot of times we just like put our color in, we take out the hex, maybe like whatever comes easiest. We all have our favorite. Like I just copy hex codes, I don't know why. Like I genuinely don't know why I use hex versus RGB versus RGBA versus HWB. Like I don't think we know why. We just got in this like norm of copying colors in a certain format. And they all actually reference, or they all show up differently. So a great question to start asking now as these color spaces start to appear is, what color space do you want this to be in? Another great reference here is to just quickly touch on the fact that there's a ton of accessibility related to color spaces, which is why you should be asking this question. So earlier, there were a lot of references to WCAG or WCAG accessibility guidelines, and the fact that in the WCAG 2.0 reference, there's this idea of color contrast, and it's this number that nobody understands of like 1 to 1.1 is like terrible, but 1 to 7 is really great, and like I don't know what that means. I think Kyle made a really good reference at the very start of like, we don't know what that means, we just trust that like if they tell us it's good, it's good. And frankly, color spaces have proved that totally wrong. Where that color contrast like sometimes says a color contrast is really great, and it's not. A great example of this is like that white on that pink comes out as like WCAG 3, like the best reference. I think it looks terrible. And the reason for that is that color spaces actually change how you perceive color, and how I perceive that white on that pink is different than the color contrast of just looking at like all white versus all pink. And so basically, that's like a really complicated color theory way of saying, go ask when you're given a color, what color space do you want this in? You can start to play with these by looking at dynamic range, so defining color as spaces like pH3, as lab colors. There's all kinds of cool stuff in there. But yeah, basically, go ask about colors. Related to colors and actually usable now is accent color. And this is fully usable. And this is the idea that like for the longest time, we had these really ugly things that were native HTML elements, and you're told to use native HTML, right? Like the better, the H3, like don't create a custom div for a button, like use the button. Okay, well, if you want me to use a custom checkbox, like can you give me a way to color it? And the answer was no for like a really long time. And now we have this thing called accent color, where you can define an accent color in your CSS, and you can color those buttons, like as easy as that. So if you were going through your code and you notice like a button, a checkbox, anything that you're trying to override like native HTML, like we do with links or all kinds of stuff like that, like go look at if accent color will do the same thing and remove a ton of that custom code in a more dynamic way. This is great for theming, great for stuff like that. Similarly, light and dark mode, we now have ways to actually look at what the browser prefers. So prefers color scheme is fully supported. Again, right now it's light and dark mode, but this is the idea that like you probably have custom toggles because dark mode is like the itness of it right now, right? So you probably have like custom ways of looking at this stuff. And that's great, but again, like that's different across browsers. Like we don't super love that. That doesn't allow us to do things like, let's say we want to custom implement a way for the browser to automatically change colors to have better contrast in dark mode or based on the time of the day or stuff like that. So if you use native elements like that, you're gonna get those automatic upgrades. So again, super easy for this, but like make use of the fact that the browser and like the millions of people working on browsers are trying to figure out auto light and dark, and like change your media queries from whatever custom way you're like adding a toggle with a like custom class that wraps your entire body that applies a class of dark mode by looking at what the browser actually is picking up from the client of if it prefers light or dark mode. Especially because let's say like we introduce a middle mode. I don't know what that would be, but there's talk of it, right? Like let's say there's like daylight mode or something like that, or like sunrise mode. You're gonna get that like awesome automatic built in. So finally with theming, use CSS variables. This is like not the craziest of hot takes, but frankly, we never hard code in JavaScript or TypeScript. And I know if any of you are reviewing a PR and there's like a hard-coded variable that's not like statically defined at the beginning of class, like you're probably going to make that comment. So why do you hard code CSS? Like, yeah, we don't know. So, frankly, I like to think of CSS as an API surface. So I know a few talks earlier was web components and this idea that we want to give people a way to override things, but also a way to be like funky on the web and use part and all these cool things. But CSS is code. And so I think web components are a great example. Anytime you're writing a component that wants to be dynamic, that wants to be flexible, like define the API of what people can and can't change about the styling of your app, and then let them use part to override anything additional. But make sure that you provide, like, again, an API surface, like inputs in an interface that allow them to know what's happening. So anytime you go through your CSS, this is, again, a really easy one, and you see anything, like search for instances of pixel, of REM, of EM, anything like that, and anytime it's like inline, think about whether or not you actually want to pull that out. Like, is that reused? Is that common to the start and end of your app? Anything like that, like think about whether or not that can be static. Or if it should be part of like the API and interface of your app. A really great example of why this is great is if you look at CSS Houdini at houdini.how.com. This is like the gold star of, I think, what this future of CSS could be, which is literally making CSS like an API, right? So like give people the options of like, this is a CSS Houdini worklet that I have that creates like a glowy light bubble thing. I use it on my website to mask like cool color ratio animation things. And basically I said like, okay, there's a bunch of lights on this, and then you can control how big those lights are. And I'm going to control the color because I want it to be confetti. You're not going to be able to do that. And I'm going to give you the option to scale up and down on those in a range that I think looks nice. Obviously, you can override that. You can make it special. But this is like CSS as an app or as an API, which I think is really cool. So from theming, ask your designers about what color space you're working in, or make a choice yourself and think about the fact that color perception is changed by color space. And then change your CSS to be essentially an API surface of CSS variables. And finally, we're going to talk about scoping, which is, right, we're talking about cascading style sheets. So we have to talk about the cascading part. And we're not going to talk about scoping because that's still like sort of a mess that's being solved. But we're going to talk about layering, specifically some like nice pancakes. So if we think about our app, we're going to use that drawer component again. And if I actually break this down, I have a bunch of layers here. So I have like this top layer of some images, a bunch of cards, my menu items on my side nav. And underneath those, we have like a layer 2, which is going to be menus that wrap around those menu items, a box that wraps around some of the cards, but not all of them. We have some free-floating cards. And then we have a drawer, and we have the app itself. And what that looks like in CSS is we're going to have this like cascading style where we have like everything at the top, so like any of our defaults, our resets, all that stuff, we're going to define in like an app CSS or a style like component sheet. Then we have our app styles, and then it starts to flow from there. And this is like what we think of when we think of CSS inheritance, right? So we think of like the fact that specificity is based on like where the element or where the component sits on our app. But you can see that there's some weird stuff happening where like, okay, so some of those cards are in those boxes, and some of them are free floating. And so you create sort of a weird love triangle where you're like, okay, I don't know what CSS inherits from what, because some of that CSS might inherit from the box. Because if those CSS are inside that box, there could be some like style leakage where let's say like the box is colored a certain way, like the card could be too. But then some of those cards are free floating. So like we want to make sure those look the same. So CSS layer is fully supported. It went from like literally no support to full support in the last like 3 months. And what CSS layer does is it allows us to specify the layers of our CSS. It allows us to create specificity layers based on the CSS architecture we're creating versus relying on this important like exclamation point thing that we never really intended people to use as widely as they do to make sure that things were showing up the way they want, right? So for everyone here, whoever writes important in your CSS, like we're gonna get rid of that right now, okay? No more important. Things aren't important. Everything's important. So the way CSS layering works is if we think about this, everything on our app we're going to define as a layer. So we have an app layer, we have our resets, all of that layer, we have our item layer, we have our menu layer. Basically everything on there that's the same component is going to be its own style layer. And we're going to define that with an @layer rule. And then what we're going to do is we're going to define those in a way that the way I write them in my single CSS style sheet is how the CSS is going to load. So if you think about like lazy loaded components, there's a lot of like style leakage where let's say like your card component is lazy loaded, and so maybe if you're loading images before your card, there could be style leakage between the specificity of, let's say like I use a similar H2 in both of these. We want to make sure that we are choosing how styles are loaded and the specificity they're given, not the browser and the way the browser is loading CSS or post-CSS. So what we're going to do here is if this is my style sheet, I'm literally going to say, like, I'm going to pick the way these layers are loaded. I'm going to define my resets. Those are going to be overridden by my defaults, which are going to be overridden by my framework, and everything that comes after will be given more specificity. That means that when I use my app, or my @layer app, and I give it a color background of yellow, anything after that is going to be given more specificity and override anything above it. So if I think about that in a smaller example, let's take an example of font size. So let's say I gave my framework a font size of 16. Then everything on my framework, so everything on this entire app is going to be font size 16. Now, if I define a layer of box after that and I give that scope to my box, then anything in the box is going to be font size 40. That means that anything written after that, normally, without layer, would have font size 40 that's inside that box, right? But the nice thing is that I can also define a card, and as long as I put my layer card after my font or my layer box, I can change that font size again. And I can say it's now going to be font size 20. Which means that if I actually look at how that works, I'm going to see that everything's going to be font size 16. My box is going to be font size 40. I'm noticing the color or the font sizes didn't change, but imagine. And then all of the cards are going to be font size 20. A similar example is if, again, I do my app background color, and I'm going to say everything's going to be yellow. Then anything inside that app layer yellow, or app app layer is going to be background yellow, unless I override it and say, actually, I can use nested layers to make sure that there's overriding the way I define it. So again, in this example, I'm setting the background color, I'm using that nested attribute, and I'm making sure that the specificity is what I want, not how CSS is loaded. This is really great in this single example, but frankly, I don't think this shows the power of it, because what we need to do is imagine that these are actually all individual components. And so with components, again, if you're like loading CSS in all these different places, what you can really do is go through, and define your layer. So step one, define your layer, and that's going to be like the single source of truth. So what you're going to do is you're going to take all of those important rules, you're going to get rid of them, then you're going to wrap every single component in a layer, and you're going to define how you want your layers to be loaded in your base style.css, or whatever you choose to name that. Not my choice. That means that you are deciding at the core level of your CSS how you want things to be specified and layered on top of each other, and how you want those overrides to work. And you don't need to use important to like override something that's leaking through. So basically, like define your layers and then wrap all of your code and load it the way that you want it to be styled specifically. So just to recap, with visibility, go change anything that you use that overrides like click events and pointer events to none, and like wrap it in inert. Like stop using CSS to control your mouse, and like use the accessibility benefits from that. So controlling scoped components and interaction patterns. With your layouts, create dynamically styled components based on the configurations. So make sure that when you're reusing components, you're like using logical properties, you're using the has and container references, you're ensuring that you're dynamic, that you're scaling, you're growing your flexbox, and CSS grid, which is now supported and you should be using. And with theming, ask what color space you should be using. Think about the fact that color contrast is changing rapidly, and that you should be using accent color and defining color by not wrapping things in a dark mode class, and instead using the auto dark and light modes. And then finally, use CSS layer to make sure that you're defining the specificity that you want for your CSS architecture. So thank you so much. Again, my name's Emma. Feel free to tweet me. Hope you enjoyed my doodles. And I have a bunch of demos, but also tweet them. So I'll just leave you with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. I want a big clap for Emma. Bigger. Thanks, everyone. We managed to get through.